sehr herzlich willkommen hier in der wunderschönen Churchill-Aula, wie immer beim Schweizerischen Institut für Auslandforschung an der Universität Zürich in diesem Frühjahrssemester. Das ist leider schon die letzte Vorstellung des Semesters, aber wir waren schon sehr fleißig und haben gut vorbereitet, auch für das Herbstsemester. Dazu noch ein paar Informationen, dann ganz am Schluss. Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome, as always, at the Swiss Institute for International Studies at the University of Zurich. After some exciting presentations, most recently Professor Schirrmacher spoke to us last week, as you might know. Today is the last evening of this semester. Now, it is a very great honor and pleasure for me to welcome our speaker here in the Churchill Auditorium of our university, Eva Illouz, a sociologist, writer, and contemporary historian who is internationally very well known to a large audience through her many books, essays, public appearances, like tonight, on topics that move the world and therefore also move us. Dear Eva, we are more than delighted that you're here. You came from Paris yesterday to Zurich. It's a great honor. Give Eva a huge hand. Thank you very much. The topic is set. Eva Illouz is speaking tonight about the poison of victimhood culture. What is it about? The fact that the role of victim has become inflationary, especially in affluent Western societies. Almost everyone, and this is now my personal observation, feels victimized in one way or another by certain circumstances, other people, overpowering institutions, foreign spheres of influence, the financial markets, climate change, or simply the fact of their own existence. Conversely, this leads to a blurred view of the dignity of real victims and suffering. If an inflation of the cult of victimhood can be observed, as there is much to suggest, then it will become increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine and real suffering. What this means for our conditions of life here in the West has hardly been adequately measured. It is therefore all the more important that distinguished academics and researchers, such as Eva Illouz, reflect on this here and now. The following should be added to our guest's biography. Eva Illouz is Directrice d'études at the EHESS, a member of the Center of Rationality at the Hebrew University. She's also a visiting researcher at the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. She's a former president of the Bezalel Academy of Arts. She is the author of 17 books, ladies and gentlemen, 17 books that have been translated into 25 languages. I'm a little bit jealous, sorry. She was awarded the French Légion d'honneur for her contribution to French culture, the Aby Warburg Prize, and the Frank Schirrmacher Prize. In addition to her academic work, she writes, for instance, for Le Monde, die Zeit, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Ha'aretz, and hopefully more and more also for Neue Zürcher Zeitung on various topics such as literature, politics, and social issues. Dear Eva, thank you once again. The floor is yours.
I want, first of all, to say how humbled and somewhat intimidated I am to be in this hall. I was told that Winston Churchill spoke here in 1946. I warn you, I will not be as entertaining as he certainly was, but still. And I want to thank very much, before I start, Professor Mayer and his marvelous wife, Megan, for the extraordinary warmth and kindness and humor and interesting conversations with which they have greeted me here in Zurich. So let me start. Since he took office, United States President Donald Trump and his administration are attempting to dismantle the power of the universities and what is commonly referred to as woke ideology. They're doing this because they have a long list of grievances based not only on a radically different ideological orientation, but also because they claim to counter and respond to the threats posed by woke ideology. This is backlash politics. A backlash politics is a very specific kind of politics. It is not only an ideology that differs or opposes the one that precedes it, but it is also a politics oriented towards fixing, repairing, countering what it claims is a decayed state of affairs. Backlash politics is a reaction to perceived cultural distortions or decadence induced by an opposing ideology and by massive social change. Political scientists Karen Alter and Michael Zern define backlash politics as 1, oriented around retrograde objectives, 2, involving extraordinary, that is very big goals, and 3, these claims and tactics enter mainstream public discourse. End of quote. Inasmuch as the MAGA movement aims explicitly to counter progressive politics, to return to traditional definitions of the family, to reinstate binary categories of gender, to restore national pride, and to reaffirm the dimensions of American power, and inasmuch as it has taken up the center of the political stage, Trumpism can safely be called a backlash political movement. So what I want to do here is describe what I think are the reasons of this backlash. The fact that I profoundly dislike Trump and Trumpism does not mean I should not try and understand what is responsible for this backlash. And so I will try to describe the woke ideology that it's supposed to be against by following the intellectual arc of my discipline, that is the sociology of culture and emotions, which tries, and I will try to see how some ideas convey and carry what Raymond Williams has called structures of feelings and public moods. Let me start by characterizing woke ideology. The concept is distressingly vague and has been identified with identity politics, another very vague term that has swept liberal polities from the late 1970s onward. This period was marked by the emergence of a new political actor, the students and the universities who started playing a significant role in social life through their protests and through student-led social movements, for example, with the Vietnam War. It was this new political actor which redefined the agenda of the liberal left, which became known as the New Left. When the Trump administration attacks the university, therefore, it is important to understand that it is attacking first and foremost what has been a significant political actor and opponent of the Republican for the last 5 decades, and what has become a very significant agent of cultural change in American society. One of the first documents invoking the notion of identity politics can be found in the Combahee River Statement, a document written by African-American women in 1978 and taught today in many American universities because it is considered to be foundational of politics of identity. The Combahee River referred to a combat to free 750 slaves who had fought heroically. And this combat was led by former slave Harriet Tubman in 1863. And so this group in 1978 used the name of this glorious historical event to name themselves. It was initiated by a group of lesbian African-American women who aimed to mark their difference from mainstream feminists. And I quote from this document. They say, as children, we realized that we were different from boys and that we were treated different, for example, when we were told in the same breath to be quiet, both for the sake of being ladylike and to make us less objectionable in the eyes of white people. In the process of consciousness raising, actually life sharing, we began to recognize the commonality of our experiences and from the sharing and growing consciousness to build the politics that will change our lives and inevitably end our oppression. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allow us to continue our struggle and work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. They said it. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity as opposed to working to end someone else's oppression, end of quote. I think this passage contains the elementary forms of identity politics and what became known later intersectionality. Perhaps the key sentence is, we believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our identity as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. So I identify 3 key beliefs. 1, the lesbian African-American group does not count on others to defend their interests. Their existential position and interest are grounded in life conditions and experiences which are so particular and different from those of other groups that they cannot use the help of others in their struggle. With time, this position evolved and identity politics, in fact, became something like to each her identity because to each her own oppression. A lesbian black woman suffers from 3 oppression and not 1 like a white one. This was a radically different understanding of justice, which had, for example, prevailed when the non-Jewish Émile Zola defended Alfred Dreyfus when he risked his life, actually, for him and drew on universalist notion of justice, which was predicated on the idea of shared truth and shared humanity. The second proposition is that self-love is not only a psychological state, but a political aim. Why provide such a centrality to self-love? Because self-love is the practical response to the evil of humiliation, lack of recognition, lack of respect, and shame. Again, this is quite significant, and it marks really a shift in traditional notions of justice. The new conception of justice now was psychological, and it made psychological demands on social structures and institutions, and would settle only when self-respect would be restored. Third proposition contained is that if conditions of oppression organize identity, it means that suffering defines the political subject and sets him or her fundamentally apart from those who either do not suffer or those who have a different form of suffering. Identity fixates membership to a group through its memory of oppression. So suffering, or the memory of suffering, becomes an organizing principle of identity. So in various forms, these three claims were conveyed, formalized, and theorized in the universities. It happened through various new disciplines, as women's studies, post-colonial studies, queer studies, ethnicity studies. The arsenal of social theory and deconstruction in the humanities and social sciences would be mobilized to explore the claim that political struggles of minorities were anchored in distinct forms of oppression, which in turn constituted distant identities, and vice versa, that identities were grounded in different forms of oppressions. Let me thus unpack these three claims, both empirically and normatively. First, the untranslatable character of struggles. The first proposition is that interests are so particular that political struggles can be only one's own. Groups can and should only represent themselves. Now, there are so many counterexamples that I think they do not even require a normative discussion and rebuttal. Let me choose a few almost randomly. Long before the idea of human rights, Catholic clergyman Bartolomé Las Casas arrived as one of the first Spaniard settlers in the Americas. He initially participated and presumably benefited from the colonial economy built on forced indigenous labor. Yet eventually he opposed and denounced the unfathomably brutal abuses committed by European colonists against the indigenous population. He gave up his laborers and started leading a struggle for Native Americans with King Charles V. Other example, during the French Revolution, some aristocrats acted against their own class. The Marquis de Lafayette, a French Freemason, fought side by side with the insurrectional army of Americans against the English from 1777 to 1783. He had previously helped draft the Declaration of Human Rights in France, which was a de facto document bringing the demise of his own class. Almost a century later, Alexis de Tocqueville, another aristocrat and a politically more slippery figure, also defended the French Revolution and democracy at a time when being a monarchist was a viable and plausible option. These two men were highly influential precisely because they betrayed their class and their interests. On another continent, in 1910 and 1920s, the Jewish American philanthropist Julius Rosenwald donated his money to fight anti-Semitism and racism against Black people. Both causes seemed equally compelling to him because, like many other Jews at the time, he viewed them as having a great deal in common. This was very far from being an isolated case. In 1941, and before America entered the war, Rabbi Alexander Good described the racial laws endured by Jews in Germany as Jim Crow laws and invoked the history of Jewish persecution in order to oppose the segregation of African Americans in his hometown in Washington. So this semantic borrowing of the vocabulary of one group to make sense of the plights of the other group suggested how much the two communities identified with each other's persecutions today. The African American and the Jewish communities would be outraged by this semantic transfer and projection of one group's history onto another. More generally, throughout the first half of the 20th century, many whites, Christians, Jews, atheists joined the struggle for civil rights of the African Americans. More than half of the white people demonstrating at the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964 were Jews. I doubt the struggle for civil rights would have been as successful as quickly if white people had not joined. You get the point. I think it's clear enough. The claim made by the Combahee River Statement that emancipation struggles are grounded in life conditions and interest, and that these cannot be defended or translated to other groups by other groups other than one owns, not only offers a strikingly narrow vision of humanity, but is also simply wrong empirically. Whether we help others out of hardwired compassion, or because we are endowed with a conscient capacity to universalize, or because we follow religious injunctions to brotherhood, I do not know. But the fact remains, we often join others with whom we have not much in common, with whom we do not share any form of oppression, even when this undercuts our own interests. Moreover, it is not difficult to detect contradictions among proponents of identity politics in this respect. In the last decades, the movement called Black Lives Matter has massively mobilized for the Palestinian cause, a group that is thousands of kilometers away and lives in conditions that have almost nothing to do with their own in the United States. And although they reject forcefully the notion of universalism as a colonialist Western idea, they identify with the faraway people and endorse their struggle. Queer activists also identify with Palestinians. As a queer activist he explains the connection. He says, queer and trans movement for liberation have long been about joint struggle for the self-determination of all oppressed people, end of quote. It should be clear that this is not Enlightenment universalism, because it makes oppression the precondition to enter into the humanity worth defending. Dr. Said Atsan, a professor of anthropology and peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College, clarifies this point. He says, what I'm arguing here is that the queer liberation struggle cannot be disentangled from the anti-imperialist struggle. They are fundamentally connected, and the existence of the queer Palestinian body is a testament to that, end of quote. Now, if there seems to be a non sequitur between the queer and the anti-imperialist causes, it is because they are not united by a universalist language of emancipation. What binds these two causes is an abstract category of oppression, a claim which somewhat contradicts the Combahee River Statement that all oppressions are particular. More exactly, I think what is at stake here is that they, having let go of universalism, of the metaphysics of universalism, identity politics becomes a politics of the common enemy. That is, it posits the oppressed as an ontological category, which is fighting another ontological category, which is the category of oppressors. So this leads to the following observations, namely that the categories of the oppressed and oppressors become very abstract and very generic, so much so that in fact they can generate what I call chains of equivalence. That is, an oppressed queer is equivalent to a post-colonial body, which is itself equivalent to a Palestinian one. That is, because you no longer have a universalist grammar to understand the political and the moral world, woke ideology becomes a politics of the common enemy through an associative chain of oppressions which are very abstractly made equivalent. Let me now move to the second proposition. Self-love is the practical response to the evil minority groups suffer from, which is lack of respect. This is a proposition whose novelty we have not appreciated enough. Traditional notions of justice had to rely somewhat on the assumption that an injustice or an offense could be objectively assessed, observed, measured even. Much of our legal system is based on this assumption. When the Dreyfus affair divided France in two, it was because a man had been accused of an act of treason he had not committed, because he was imprisoned when he should have been free, because state officials had fabricated false pieces of evidence. Justice could be established when the objective materiality of his innocence was established. More interestingly, and this is a slightly different point, it is little known that after Dreyfus was pardoned, he re-entered the French army as a reserve officer. It was voluntary with the outbreak of the World War I. And these offenses, the series of deep offenses that he had been inflicted, did not make him waver in his commitment to the nation or to the French army. That is, the repeated humiliations, calumnies, intrigues, imprisonment, fabrications he had suffered did not alter his loyalty. I'm simply mentioning this to say that the Combahee River Statement actually outlines a very different type of self. The self is very different. The wounds to the self in the Combahee River Statement become primordial. They take precedence in a way that would have been perhaps incomprehensible or less comprehensible to Dreyfus. The self now demands intangible goods like self-respect or, as is often said, recognition. It is reconceptualized by identity politics in such a way that institutions must now bestow on individuals self-respect as members of excluded groups and not as human beings with universal rights, but as members of particular communities. Now, let me be clear. There is no doubt that many identities can become crippled through persistent shaming and repeated humiliation. Homosexuality is the paradigmatic example of a group which was systematically shamed and which denied and ultimately vanquished that systemic shame. Securing for homosexuals conditions for self-respect was genuine moral progress, because a decent society is one which does not humiliate people for who they are, a point that has been made by Avishai Margalit. We should never forget that, as Charles Taylor put it, misrecognition can inflict a grievous wound, saddling its victims with a crippling self-hatred. Identity politics was a salutary reaction to the shame in which many groups of people were steeped, not only sexual, but also racial, ethnic, religious, and physical. After World War II, a decisive change happened in the moral cultures of Western nations. And these cultures started to bestow radical notions of dignity on the human person. Shaming and shame was no longer tolerable, and identities needed to be protected in that respect. And yet, I would like to say that making recognition into the sole object of politics as has been insistently hammered by various groups of identity politics, is fraught with aporias, conceptual dead ends. The first aporia has to do with the fact that, I think, first of all, we cannot require unconditional respect for all culture. Why? Because actually moral change and progress happen sometimes, not always, but sometimes it happens through a lack of respect for cultures. Abraham monotheism broke the statues of idol worshippers and set on the course that established universalism and the idea of the unity of mankind and womankind. Major disrespect. Jesus did not respect Roman religion and flouted the institution of the family. Major disrespect. Homosexuals did not respect the homophobia of Judeo-Christian religion. Major disrespect. Feminism disrespected the bourgeois family and the role of women were supposed to play in it. Major disrespect. Emancipatory transformations are often a lack of respect for the culture they want to replace and they criticize. But the politics of recognition makes it difficult to understand the difference between the disrespect which achieves emancipatory transformation and the disrespect which humiliates simply because you feel superior. And why? Because it no longer has a plausible grammar of the universal requirements of emancipation. Making recognition into the exclusive principle of our politics disempowers us from the capacity to criticize cultures. Worse than that, the only culture that people are now allowed to criticize in the politics of recognition is their own, that is our own. And so if you bestow only recognition to other cultures, and if you bestow only critique to your own, it is bound to create an asymmetry. For example, Judith Butler encouraged Afghan women to wear their burqa as a sign of resistance to America. So, you see, when you hear this, I think it becomes clear that this asymmetry is not lost on most people. It becomes more than an asymmetry. It becomes something that looks like a hypocrisy. And so this has had, I think, the effect of undermining the moral credibility of the project of recognition. The second reason why recognition is fraught with difficulties is that the politics of recognition almost intrinsically centers around offendedness. I will use the example of the microaggressions which have become central to the campus politics of the last 20 years. Again, it is not by chance that the politics of microaggression arose on campuses, which is also central to my point. Kevin Nadal, professor of psychology at John Jay College for Criminal Justice, defines a microaggression as follows. He says, microaggressions are the thinly veiled, everyday instances of racism, homophobia, sexism, and more that you see in the world. Sometimes it's an insult, other times it's just an errant comment or gesture, end of quote. In other words, a microaggression is a sense of discomfort that a person may feel and which that person attributes to a lack of respect, which she attributes in turn to sexism, racism, homophobia. Interestingly, this new conceptualization of what a political offense is does not require the offender to be conscious or even ill-intentioned. Whatever discomfort is felt by the offended defines actually that an offense has taken place, regardless of the intentions of the offender. I think this is a dramatic reconceptualization of offenses, because it locates the existence and the nature of the offense in its subjective impact, that is, in the offended. And my point here is a double one. The notion of microaggression now casts a very wide net. Any blemish on the self in an interaction can potentially become an attack on someone's identity. And the offended person holds now the key to claim that an offense has taken place. I would like to quote now Shelby Steele, who is a prominent African-American scholar at the Stanford Hoover Institute. He himself lived under Jim Crow and was a part of the Black struggle in the 1970s. He says, "When I visit university campuses today, Black students often tell me that racism is everywhere around them, that the university is a racist institution. When I ask for specific examples of racist events or acts of discrimination, I invariably get nothing at all, or references to some small slight that requires the most labored interpretation to be seen as racist. Global racism allows these students to feel aggrieved by racism even as they live on campuses notorious for almost totalitarian regimes of political correctness, and to feel more grieved than Black students did 40 years ago before the civil rights victories. This is because their feeling of racial aggrievement is calibrated to the white guilt on university campuses and not to actual racism." End of quote. Let me give you a second quote by John McWhorter, a great African-American linguist who teaches at Columbia University. "When I taught at Berkeley in the 1990s, I spoke with a Black student who had attended a protest against the banning of racial preferences in admissions. He told me that attending Berkeley meant constantly encountering racism. I asked him what kinds of things he was referring to, and he responded that he had never been asked such a question before. After a pause, he mumbled that white students regularly gave him looks. The reality is that today, elite universities are among the least racist places on the planet. Of course, racism still exists, we know that. But what these two people are saying is that it's very unlikely that they experienced that racism at the elite and posh universities of America. So these quotes, in turn, help me highlight something important, which is that offendedness is important. The sense of offendedness is something these people cannot let go of. And what they do is that they translate maybe minor indignities into the capital crime of racism, because it has become a form of identity, how they define themselves, how we define ourselves. They're not alone. You may ask, then, what is the problem with what seems to be actually a revision of human relations that demand a more sophisticated and sustained attention to a variety of others? Why not? So let me say why I don't think this is a good idea to extend so much the notion of offendedness. The first reason is that recognition is almost chronically and structurally in short supply. Evaluation systems have been put in place almost everywhere to rank and compare people in schools, corporations, universities, and even dating sites. Whether economic or academic organizations are highly competitive and highly evaluative. Most of us will lose at most competitions because of the huge asymmetry between the spots available and the number of people who want them. Whether it is the hope for promotion, a job we apply to, the book that was rejected, the romantic object who prefers someone else to us, we will lose at most competitions. So rejections of this kind entail lack of recognition, and they definitely undermine the integrity of the self, no doubt. And yet, by attributing them to sexism or racism, we make it difficult to recognize that many others who are not like us may lose at the same competitions for other reasons, because, precisely as I said, the system is built to create a vast pool of losers. And so this is, for example, manifest in the controversy between François Ruffin and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, two key left French politicians. François Ruffin broke with the extreme left LFI because he claims the left cannot turn only to the sons and daughters of immigrants. For Ruffin, French working and middle classes are also struggling and thus must be included in the agenda of the left. But Jean-Luc Mélenchon refused. He did not want to this kind of inclusiveness. He preferred to address only the exclusions of the sons and daughters of immigrants, of the immigrant population. And so rather than more pervasive forms of exclusion, another way to say the same thing is that ordinary white working class and middle class white people have been left without a legitimate vocabulary to address their sense of exclusion. No wonder that many of them turned to the extreme right or to self-help culture, which seem to be the sole ideologies around willing to give a language to their grievances. The second reason why our society suffers from a chronic lack of recognition is that society set up ideals of characters that are precisely this, ideals that very few people can reach. But the new politics of self-love makes it difficult or impossible to hold people accountable to ideals because it is translated as a deficit of recognition. I want to give you an example. On August 2024, the Washington Post ran a story on a black couple who were suing their neighbors for racism. Their neighbors, I think about a dozen of them, including some African Americans, had complained repeatedly of the very loud noise and nuisance their frequent and large parties produced. But the couple thought that the fact that the police came to their doorstep several times in order to stop the noise was motivated by racism and therefore turned to the court. And of course, seeing a policeman on your doorstep is a very highly unpleasant experiences, and we should not forget that in the United States this experience is often actually dangerous for black people. And still, we cannot be prohibited from asking the question whether these neighbors had in principle the right to be annoyed by uncommonly high noise and to take action when that noise persisted. But in the brave new world of identity politics, if an interaction diminishes one's self-respect, it becomes an offense to one's identity, here defined by race. It translates what is in fact a rather benign accusation, you are a noisy neighbor, into a heinous crime of racism. It thus represents an escalation in the hierarchy of offenses whose effect is to silence the person who complains and to empower the offended. It has the dramatic consequence of canceling out the very idea that all of us, members of minority and majority groups, are equally accountable to character ideals. For example, here, being a good neighbor. Now, I want to be clear. It is undeniable that many offenses are motivated by sexism and racism, of course. But if we do not have a vocabulary and a moral grammar to distinguish between these heinous offenses and what I would call the ordinary rudeness and pettiness and conflict between people, the suspicion of racism or sexism starts to loom very large, perhaps too large. It starts to loom over every unsuccessful interaction when heterogeneous groups interact with each other. And so what this means is that at the same time that some groups define themselves as oppressed, they will have, and they do have actually, an epistemological and moral primacy in the interaction. They present themselves disempowered while wielding a new kind of power, as I said, epistemological, I know, you don't know, and moral. My offense has a much higher status than your denial that you did not intend to offend me. So there is here an enormous inconsistency, if you want, between the claim of oppression and the pragmatic uses, the pragmatic power it entails. This consistency is not lost on many people. For example, let me give you an example of how you can use this inconsistency. When some members of the Jewish community blast critiques of Israel as anti-Semitic, they are weaponizing offendedness. When people warn about the dangers of Islamist infiltration of Western societies, they're dubbed Islamophobic. These two cases constitute a weaponization of anti-racist language to shield Israeli or radical Islamist interests from critique. And so this is, again, connected to the paradox of a speech which declares oppression or racism while effectively shutting down opponents in uncomfortable, while effectively shutting down opponents. So to just recap my second point, the politics of recognition escalates minor conflicts, transforms what can sometimes be benign slights into larger forms of hatred. It subjectivizes and psychologizes the political. The objectivity of an offense is transformed into the affirmation of a subjective wound. That is, it makes offended people the sole arbiters of whether an offense has actually taken place. The third proposition, and I move to the conclusion, is that groups are defined by their membership to a racial, religious, gender, or sexual orientation, but not in any way. It is their oppression and their suffering which define and constitute this membership. This may be the most fundamental transformation of the post-1960s era. A large number of commentators have observed that we live in a culture of victimhood. Less remarked is the fact that the memorialization of the Shoah has played a significant role in this transformation because it sacralized victims in a way that is absolutely unprecedented in human history. Think about this. Human beings who had been reduced to barely recognizable human form, to walking skeletons, became the heroes of culture. Again, we have not appreciated enough how much this marked a fundamental historical rupture. In most societies, most of the time, being a victim is something that must be effaced, either by silence or by revenge. The duel, for example, was an institution whose main goal was to erase the status of victim publicly and visibly in order to re-establish one's honor. In honor culture, victims have lost their honor, and if they have, they are deprived of their social status completely. Injury, shame, loss of honor, and erasure of status, all of this went together. A raped woman, for example, lost her status and could not marry anymore because she's fundamentally stained. This is why also when Sextus Tarquinius rapes the noble Roman woman Lucretia, she commits suicide. Silence or suicide is the fate that many or most victims met. One of the immense contributions of identity politics, which followed on the sacralization of victims by the Shoah, has been to no longer make victimization into a source of shame. And to that extent, identity politics has marked, in my opinion, a considerable moral progress. The shame is no longer with the victim, but with the victimizer. And we are much better able to attend to the multiple injuries inflicted on victims of violence, incest, discrimination, hate crimes. The problem with victimhood culture is not that victimhood has become a strange badge of honor. It is not that some people abuse it, although some people abuse it. It is not either that it makes people whiners or lack agency, although that also may be true. In my opinion, these drawbacks are a price worth paying for refusing that victims of all kinds of forms of hatred could live now in dignity. When does it become a problem? It becomes a problem when being a victim turns the crime of the offender into an enduring, intrinsic, inherent guilt for a group which becomes ontologically defined by the offense it has committed. Shelby Steele, the same one I quoted before, gives the example of what he calls white guilt in his wonderful book of the same name. He argues that the black politics of emancipation, which helped fight abject racism, has turned into a politics in which whites have taken on the moral authority to carry guilt, to bear alone moral responsibility, to be alone moral agents. White people have taken on an acute sense of guilt vis-à-vis the colonial past and the murderous enterprise of slavery, creating, he says, a new kind of moral asymmetry between them and black people, dispossessing black people of moral agency. And he contrasts the white guilt, contemporary black militancy, which is you're white, you're guilty, to the Malcolm X type of militancy in the 1960s, which, in his words, was the authentic militancy. It was one which demanded from black people that they separate themselves from white and that they find in themselves the strength, the spiritual, and the moral resources to build themselves anew, to bear responsibility for their emancipation. But the politics of offendedness is different. It does not want to abandon what Wendy Brown has called wounded attachments. It cannot distinguish between what post-colonial historian Deepesh Chakrabarti has called historical truth and historical wound, the latter being a mix of history and memory, that is, a part of one's identity. Identity becomes defined by memory of the wound and wants the victimizer, the past oppressor, to carry that memory of that wound as well. This is the reason why it cannot settle accounts. While a duel or revenge settled scores and thereby brought the offense to closure, offended culture, offendedness, does not have such mechanism. It can only leave wounds open because the self becomes defined by this memory. And in leaving the wounds open, it is also the guilt of the perpetrator which becomes open-ended. The heart of the Trumpist backlash, I believe, lies very much on this, on a generalized sense of offendedness whose truth is owned only by the offended person, which in turn generates lingering and generalized and unresolved and non-absolvable guilt. It is not by chance that guilt has become a key topic of the extreme right. Ron DeSantis of Florida has forbidden to teach anything that makes whites guilty. It's just unbelievable. He forbids the teaching of slavery. This appalling measure suggests that guilt has actually become a stake of political struggles. The sinister AfD, Höcke, has also mentioned the fact that he's tired, that Germans are tired of being guilty. If we look at the discourses of the extreme right, both in the USA and in Europe, I think it will be very easy to observe that, among other things, they are about a fierce rejection of guilt. In the USA, by the way, just recently an executive order passed in April 2025, and it is called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, forbade congressional transfer of funds to exhibits in national museums such as the Smithsonian if they present a negative image of the USA showing the faults and follies of American history. So in identity politics, there is an excess of guilt floating around. I would say that guilt is no longer attached even to specific acts or person or events, but it has become a kind of generalized and vague signifier which can latch potentially on anyone, and especially on the groups defined ontologically as oppressors. Here again, we must be very careful. Remembering the past and the real guilt of colonialism, Nazism, genocides, is just non-negotiable from my standpoint. In many cases, memory should be also accompanied by reparations. This is exactly what the African-American intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates has suggested. He has made a very powerful case for reparations for the immense destructions of which slavery has wreaked on the lives of African Americans. I take this argument very seriously. I take it seriously if reparations are a way to recreate the social contract, that is, to acknowledge responsibility and to engage in a path of reconciliation. This is very different from the politics of victimhood, which does not want to come to closure. The culture of victimhood prefers to leave the wound open and the offense unrepaired, thus letting the guilt to float freely, potentially striking any member of the group which has been defined as ontologically oppressing. Conclusion. So here we are today in the midst of a profound backlash, because identity politics is not consistent with itself, because it has abandoned the plausible grammar of universalism, because it has made oppression its main object of struggle, because it multiplies offenses, because it psychologizes politics and creates lingering guilt. Far from being a bulwark against the extreme right, we may wonder if this left has not, in fact, helped pave the road to it. It has fractured the liberal camp in two, pitting a universalist left against an identitarian one, or as in the case of Germany, it has split an anti-immigrationist left against one which is uncomfortable discussing any immigration policy. In most European countries, the working class no longer votes for the left, and why would they? The identitarian left has been simply tone deaf to its concerns. Disindustrialization, the precarity of working class jobs, inflation, or the decay of infrastructures and neighborhoods have nothing to do with identity. So the relentless, in addition, the relentless indictment of whiteness in the USA has provoked an identitarian Christian and ultra-nationalist backlash, which can now flex again its previously flabby muscles. Identity politics tracks power everywhere, and in doing so, it invariably confuses the trivial and the significant, often preferring to chase the trivial because it is easier, and to leave intact what should have been its main focus, namely inequalities, kleptocracy, increasing concentration of power. A politics which aimed to fight racism has turned race into an essence from which neither whites nor blacks can escape. While sexuality has become astonishingly fluid, race has become strikingly rigid, making it more difficult to overcome the perception that human beings are defined by race. This left has fractured vulnerabilities and minorities. Because it has become a politics of the common enemy and not a politics of common humanity and fraternity, it confuses defending the right of queer people or of African Americans who are brutalized with the defense of Hamas terrorist millenary ideology. We saw this very clearly on October 7th. We need to reconstruct universalism by inviting all cultural groups to expand and enrich this notion from within the horizon of their tradition. Ghanaian philosopher Ato Seki Otu reflected about universalism in his culture. Universalism, he claims, is as crucial to African thought as it is to European, and he adds, to suggest that the universalist idea of the human is only white and European is a profound insult to his culture. I completely understand him. What is universalism? Instead of defining it, I will give you only one example. I will define it by the example. In 2024, the prosecutor of the Court of Palermo, Jerry Ferrara, seeking to send to jail Matteo Salvini for sequestration and negligence when he did not let a ship of the NGO Open Arms, which contained 147 refugees, disembark. Ferrara justified his indictment as follows. He said, "One key principle that is not debatable," I forgot to say that the fact he did not let them provoked a lot of diseases and terrible conditions. So Ferrara said, "One key principle that is not debatable. Between human rights and the protection of the state's sovereignty, it is human rights that must prevail in our, fortunately, democratic systems." This is the universalist argument. All human beings are equal in front of the law, and even a powerful minister must face the law. That's one element. And second, which I find even more thrilling, is that refugees actually have a greater right than that of a state, because they have inalienable rights. They have the rights of human beings. They are universal, irrespective of their skin color, nationality, religion, or citizenship status. This is the legal and moral glory of universalism. It is a universalism it is only universalism that was responsible for so much of our moral progress. The idea of the unity of the humankind is the only politics worth fighting for. It is the politics of common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva, for this brilliant, sobering, courageous conversation. And you are a true universalist, and we appreciate that in the tradition of Voltaire and other eminent philosophers of the Enlightenment. You said reconstructing universalism, that should be the goal. I personally couldn't agree more, but you also showed very brilliantly the anti-tendencies, which makes, especially in intellectual circles, the situation difficult, sometimes uncomfortable, and sometimes not possible to discuss anymore. So my question is, and then I quickly open to the audience here, how could intellectuals like you motivate students, people, other intellectuals, to be a little more open-minded, to re-establish actually the notion and also the morals of universalism, because universalism has a very strong moral message?
I always get stuck with the questions about how to fix things. I know how. I mean, I'm unlike like doctors. I like to identify diseases, but unlike them, I don't have any medicine. So how to insufflate again? I don't know. I mean, I think first of all, most of us have a universalist moral intuition. And if people are honest with themselves, they can only consult their intuition and their moral intuition. We have the intuition that there is a unity to man and womankind. If that does not meet your intuition, I think when I say this, it does not resonate with anything one feels, I confess that I wouldn't even try. But if when I say this, it resonates with somebody, then, you do a Socratic work of trying to work on this fundamental intuition that we have, that there is a unity of mankind. And by working on this intuition, I would try to extirpate the idea of, the kind of moral, with these oubliettes, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in French, the ways in which the idea of universalism not only has been thrown into a dark room, but has also been very solid, has also been viewed and translated as the equivalent of conservative, racist, colonialist politics.
Yes, another sort of colonialism.
Exactly. So I think what would need to be done is what I simply started to do at the end of my paper, which is to show that the universalist intuition exists almost in all cultures. You would, undig it in African culture. You would undig it in Chinese and India. For sure in India, there's a very powerful universalist streak in Indian culture. And then you would need to reconstruct this universalism by, again, either integrating or presenting side by side these different forms of universalism. I think, and that is why I was very careful to say at the end of my presentation that we need to reconstruct it by inviting all cultures to rebuild it from within the horizon of their tradition, because I'm convinced it exists in very many non-Western traditions. And I think this way we could perhaps start convincing people that there is a glory to this idea, and that it is not only Western at all. It corresponds to a fundamental moral intuition that many of us have.
Absolutely. I mean, you also can watch it when an education of a child, for instance, or children, this is one of the first essential lessons you learn, to share your responsibility and respect from others and by others and with others without already differentiating certain, how should I say, skills or whatever it is, or yeah, this kind of, and you say, okay, we build a group where everybody is equal in his own way, but we accept that there is a law, a moral law, like Kant said, to give recognition to everybody of us. But this is now totally jeopardized. And I would say it's, sorry, in this hall you can give this brilliant speech. But in many other halls, in other countries, it's almost impossible to talk about that freely, or you are even forbidden to do that, either in America, and now you brilliantly showed both sides of the hell. On the one side, this kind of university fanatism, a little bit provocative, and the other side is Trumpism, which is maybe even worse, and the middle way, the way of reason and responsibility gets more and more narrow. Okay, now we're in the middle of criticism of civilizations. It sounds very, very dark and gloomy, and of course we also want to have some takeaways to get home and say, okay, now we learned, and the next morning I do a different breakfast for my wife or whatever, with my dog or with my students or with my environment, whatever. And so I would like to open.
I would just say something to what you said.
Sure.
Is this working? I'm not sure. Do you hear me? Yeah, wonderful. I would not define myself as a middle. I always dislike it. I don't want to be in the middle. I view myself as a radical universalist, to use the expression of Omri Böhm, although I don't share his politics. But I don't think I am between this and between that, because they're completely wrong. So if I was in the middle, I would take the mistakes of this side and the other side. I think I would be afraid of doing that. I think what I'm saying is that universalism is simply something different. It's another direction.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have the opportunity to ask questions. Please go ahead. And let's make it a universal rule tonight that the questions are not too long and the answers will then fit to the length of the question.
Very brief question, please. You mentioned the time perspective when you were talking about repatriation. And the guilt culture, where sort of when you come to a reconciliation, the issue is closed. Whereas if this guilt culture continues, it's like an open wound. Now, I just wonder whether there might be a purpose of having an open wound, of being sensitive enough to ongoing oppression, to ongoing racism, because that kind of insight never stops. So there needs to be some kind of an open wound to make you sensitive enough for this attack.
It's a fantastic question, really. And I'm not sure I have an answer for it. But one of the things that is very interesting that Steele, the one I quoted already, Sheldon Steele, one of the things he says, and it's a brilliant insight, he says we, meaning we black people, have given all the moral authority to the white people by making them be guilty and constantly caring for the injuries they may have inflicted on us. So that's one thing that he says. He's saying this guilt is a form, in fact, he doesn't go as far as saying it, but it's not difficult to push the point and see where he's getting to. He's saying this guilt, in fact, gives moral power. and makes you more moral than the group towards which you feel guilty. That's one point. The second point, and I would not want to draw too much on Freud at all, but I don't know if you can actually carry with you guilt all the time. I mean, you know, think of parents who make us feel guilty. They make us feel profoundly resentful too, I think. I mean, we comply on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are very resentful, and we feel we know it, whatever moral voice we have is not really our own. So in that sense, if you wanted to think like a moral philosopher, I don't know if morality out of guilt, out of permanent guilt, is the kind of morality we should aspire to. Now, understand me, I much prefer someone who walks around with constant guilt to
the opposite.
Trump, or, you know, who never feels guilty about anything. So, of course, that goes without saying. This is a much more tolerable, livable society. But again, I mean, what I wanted to understand is the nature of the backlash. And I'm not judging it, I'm just trying to understand what went wrong and what are the things that may have made this person, Donald Trump, ride on such a wave of fury and anger. And I think that's one of them. It is because feeling guilty is a very difficult job. I mean, Germany took a very long time, and it took real indoctrination, despite you know, the obviousness of the crimes it had committed. And it didn't last that long. Even now, many people say we're fed up with being guilty. So we would have to look more into the social psychology of guilt. I don't think as a group it is easy to overcome, I mean, it is easy to carry. That is why the method of truth and reconciliation is such a smart thing. It didn't work in South Africa. It seems to have worked more in Rwanda. But it's so smart because the principle of truth and reconciliation is precisely not to make the guilt of one party linger for too long in order to recreate the social contract in a way.
Not to forget that, I mean, guilt is one of the most successful business models of religions, no? For 5,000 years, and somehow it comes back again. I really sometimes wonder, where is Voltaire? Écraser l'infâme, c'est perdu, cette vision, no? Okay, next question, please. Over there, behind, and then here.
Hello. Thank you so much for...
I'm sorry, I don't see you. Yes.
Should I stand up?
Oh, that would be nice.
Yes.
Oh, sure. Hi. Oops. Talking about guilt, I wanted to ask about forgiveness. You said also how you said much more comfortable walking around with guilty people feeling guilt. I feel like guilt and this circle of apologies and the right to forgiveness. I don't know if you can say a couple of words into the direction of, I mean, thinking of Trumpism and, as you said, the Germans that are tired of guilt. For me, in my head, it screams of like the forgiveness, or that topic of forgiveness. And
again, it's a beautiful question. I haven't really thought about it, but you know, I'm a Jew, and Jews don't do that much forgiveness as Christians. Christians are very good about forgiveness. Not so much Jews. No, I'm serious. And I think But I think also that it is a very bad idea for people like African Americans who have had simply an extraordinarily, I don't know, an extraordinary destruction of their lives for 200 years or more in the United States. I would find it almost immoral to say, well, you will give your forgiveness and everything will be resolved. That, I think, for me would be immoral, and I don't think it makes sense. I could be wrong, but I don't think it would make political sense. I think forgiveness works in interpersonal relations. I think it works extremely well, especially in a relation which is bound to continue, let's say a brother, for example. You're not going to get rid of your brother that easily. So in the framework of interpersonal relations, forgiveness are often a very good way to resolve conflict. It's a tool of conflict resolution. I don't think it works, and I don't think it should work at the level of group, of the history between groups, especially in cases of large-scale atrocities, as with the Shoah, as in Congo, as with the slavery in America. But I could be wrong, but that's my...
And then somehow it's also connected to the notion of sin, again, in religion. And I remember, as a former member of the Catholic Church, so we went to the confession, right? And there was a wonderful institution, because first you were a deadly sinner, more or less. You could do whatever you wanted, and then you confessed, and then the priest said, ego te absolvo peccatis tuis, and then we went out of church, and the sun was shining, and we could start again. But I don't want to ironize that, but just to show you certain patterns of how institutions can manipulate also people, first to make them guilty, or born sinners, original sinners, and then they have means, and in the Middle Ages you had to pay, then you are free. Oliver Rico has a question.
Absolutely. I'll just add this just to the gentleman's question. I will just add this. I just remember that the German for guilt is debt. And I think there is something in when you have been aggrieved, there must be an exchange of something. This is what the notion of debt, that is, if you have offended me, you owe me something. And then that is the notion of reparation, and then it needs to be repaired. And that is what is lost in forgiveness. There is not this work, this social work of reparation and exchange.
Oliver?
Hello. Thank you very much, Ms. Eva Illouz, for your speech, very interesting speech. I hear victimhood, universalism, moral, but one word was missing, resentment.
Lots of words were missing.
Yeah, no, but I wanted to know, or I would like to hear from you as a sociologist of emotions, about resentment in our society.
In general? For Nietzsche and for Scheller, resentment is a specific type of envy. And I mean, it starts from why him and not me? That's the movement in resentment. But there's an additional thing. I think it's Scheller who adds this dimension, which I find really interesting. In resentment, you want to take revenge against someone, or you want to take away something from someone that he has and you don't have. But you can't. And that's why Nietzsche and Scheller had contempt for resentment. They had contempt for resentment because it is the emotion of the weak. It is the emotion of the one who wants to have that beautiful watch, but can't have it, and therefore will say, all the people who have watches are idiots. Something like this. That's it's spite, it's resentment. I'm much more ambivalent towards resentment, because I think there is a democratizing force in resentment, which, by the way, I think Nietzsche understood. For Nietzsche, resentment was the emotion of democracies. That's why he despised democracies. But I think that saying, why them and not me, is often actually the right emotional reaction. Why them and not you? So I think resentment is it is an emotion of equality that demands equality, even if in a fairly disgraceful way. It becomes problematic when, in my opinion, when it is addressed to the wrong groups. For example, when white people think that the reason why their salaries have stagnated since the 1980s is because the black people have benefited from the quotas or have benefited from affirmative action, and resent minorities for what they think are privileges they receive, that is a completely misdirected resentment, in my opinion. The problem of resentment, in my opinion, even if it has some not so nice features, it's a sad passion, as Spinoza would have called it, still I think it is politically very useful and very good. It is dangerous when it is geared to the wrong group. By the way, I think this is what the Jews experienced in Germany and in Austria at the beginning of the 20th century, given that they entered in a fairly very quick way, in a massive way, the professions of doctors and lawyers, and had acquired university education, as opposed to the non-Jews. I mean, in percentage-wise, the Jews were vastly overrepresented. So again, when the economic crisis arrives, it becomes very obvious to blame it on the Jews because of this simmering resentment. That's, for me, the problem of resentment. Not so much its psychological structure. I think we are all resentful, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay, as you see, we can continue now for the next 3 hours, and it would be very, very fascinating, but time runs out, and the only promise is that Eva will be soon back. You don't know that yet, but this is now officially announced, so I commit myself and Sabine Sura to that. And I think it was especially fascinating tonight because, first of all, the conference, and on a high level, very, very delicate also in argumentations. But what happened now, this is kind of this discussion, forth and back, and you know, genuine thinkers, you can see how and when they think, like now. So it's not just this kind of comes out like whatever, some speech as Orwell described it, so thinking and rethinking and recorrecting, and that is actually the best thing what philosophy can do, even if it's not always so consistent. But the inconsistency itself is a sign of quality. So, this said, I have to go upstairs here. Unfortunately, I feel very comfortable, but...
if I may just say, it was a great pleasure.
It's not finished yet. No. Now comes the serious business. But before, sorry, there is some sheet here underneath. Yes.
I wrote on it.
Well, it's all fine. Yeah. Okay, also, we are working on that. It's not finished yet, and you see a couple of heads. Some you might know, some less. So, for instance, the lady, yes, on top left, is Stefanie Papst. She is one of the foremost analysts of conflicts and war, and was and still sometimes is involved in the high command of NATO. An absolute must. Maybe she's not so famous as Thucydides, but anyway, the quality is high and she has a lot to say. Then in the middle, this nice guy with the nice smile is Alexandre Fasel, Secretary of State of our Foreign Department. It's the first time he speaks in public. We made a reservation and a deal with him, and he agreed, and he said, okay, I come to you first, and this is also a premiere. Then we have Stefan Bierling. He's he's a specialist in politics and expert for transatlantic relations and American politics. Then we have, it is difficult to pronounce, Sabine, how is that? Keir Giles, British author, expert for Russian military. Now, this you have to listen to. And the lady in the middle, Katrin Eigendorf, she is a war reporter and a TV journalist. You might know her from German and other TV. And she's very, very courageous, and she does amazing things. You not thank you. She goes to Ukraine. She's embedded, and she has a lot of things to tell us. And finally, last but not least, the guy you know, he agreed to come, and it will be a lively discussion with my special friend Habeck. He has a little more time now, and he is always relaxed. He's a true philosopher. He also writes children's books. Not always his opinion, but this can make it even more interesting. And he's brilliant. He's a brilliant speaker, and he has a strong sense for entertainment. We also have on the list, this is, I don't know if it works out, the widow of Navalny. She should come also, she told us, but as you know, she is highly exposed, and we don't know if it will work out. And then, of course, we always have also surprise guests, as always. So this is work in progress. And now we proceed to the gift, right, Sabine? Yeah, okay, this is always a punishment because people don't know what they get, and then they have to cope with it. Yeah, you get a gift now. But, you know, we have a museum of all the gifts people gave us back because they didn't like them. And this is actually interesting, and it's connected to the university archives. No, I'm kidding, it's not true. But, okay, you are a fan of Albert Camus, right? Me too. One of the greatest writers of the 20th century, every word he wrote, and some guy wrote a pretty good book about him, even if it's still in German. And it's even worse just to hold it in your hands. So again, thank you, Eva, this was brilliant.